Chapter 5, Del Duke. An ignoramus shoots at the wrong thing and hits it. Del Duke could not believe that he had ended up in the sprawling agricultural community. He had daydreamed bigger than this. Delwood was his mother's last name, and he had been saddled with it as a first name at birth, but thankfully no one had ever called him Delwood. He was Del from the start. While Del hated his first name, he took some measure of pride in Duke. Only a few relatives knew that 2 generations before, the name had been Dolphicanus, but his Greek ancestor George, as far as Del was concerned, had done the right thing. Del hinted to anyone who would listen that his family had something to do with starting a university, and they had at one point worn a crown. Early on, Del Duke had wanted to be a doctor because he liked TV shows with heroic people who saved lives every week while showing off perfect teeth and great haircuts. Plus, Dr. Del Duke sounded good. He had 3 Ds, which sounded better than 2. And so Del studied biology in college, which didn't go well because he couldn't store facts. They shifted and then moved and quickly evaporated from his conscious mind. And if they were buried somewhere in his unconscious, he had no access to that area of thought. So by his second semester, he changed his major for the 4th time, moving from the hard sciences to the soft sciences. Del finally graduated on the 6.5-year plan with a degree in psychology. From there, after a lot of searching, he got a job at an assisted living center where he was the activities director. Del was let go after only 3 months. The elderly didn't like him. He lacked true compassion, and he had no stomach for their health problems. On more than one occasion, he was seen running from the activities room in a full-blown panic. Del was too afraid to work with prison inmates, and so he set his sights on the public school system. Del went to night classes, and after 3 more years, got a certification for adolescent counseling, and that put him on the path to work in education. But no one was hiring. Del sent out literally hundreds of resumes, and after 3 years working as a barback, carrying tubs of used glasses to the Shirley dishwashers, he finally added some bogus counseling work experience to his resume and got a bite. Bakersfield. On paper, it looked incredible. The map showed that he would be in Southern California. He imagined a life of surfboards with groups of tan people eating medium-spiced corn chips on his seaside balcony. But the Central Valley had entire months where the temperature hit 100 degrees every single day. It was flat and dry and landlocked. Bakersfield was no Malibu. It wasn't even Fresno. Del accepted the position, packed up his barely drivable Ford, and headed south. He didn't have a going-away party when he left Walla Walla, Washington, because no one cared that he was leaving. As a counselor for the Bakersfield City School District, Del's job was to handle the difficult cases. And by that, the district meant the middle school students who got into trouble almost exclusively for behavioral issues. These were the kids who caused enough trouble to be dealt with off-site. A typical day for Del consisted of reviewing dozens of emails filed weekly from principals. Some of the students were reported because they had turned physically violent. They were kids who targeted other kids. This meant an automatic suspension if the incident was on school grounds. You could beat up someone, but you had to make sure it wasn't in the school cafeteria or the parking lot. The sidewalk was a perfectly fine place. Other cases involved truancy. It struck Del as ironic that there were kids who didn't go to school and they would be punished for not attending with the threat of being kicked out altogether. In addition to the violent students and the no-shows, there were the kids who did drugs and the ones who stole things. But these cases never made it in to see Del. The system took care of the young criminals on its own. Del resented that he didn't get FaceTime with the real bullies. They had a lot of personality and could be quite entertaining. It was the rest of the screw-ups who were left to counseling. There were 3 educational therapists who handled all the cases. Dell was the fresh hire after Dickie Winkleman, who had served for 42 years, retired. Dell never met Dickie Winkleman, but from what he heard, the guy was a broken man when he finally walked out the door. As the new guy on the block, Dell was given the kids who the other 2 counselors didn't want. The way Dell saw it, he got the losers of the losers. But Dell was okay with that because it wasn't like the students he saw would run and tell someone what a crummy job he was doing. They had already turned against the system before they arrived. Score! Dell was now in his mid-30s, and while he wasn't insightful or even thoughtful, he knew that his counseling job in Bakersfield would make or break him. But Dell had always had an issue with organization. He couldn't throw things away because he had trouble figuring out what had value and what didn't. Plus, he liked the comfort of possessions. If he couldn't belong to something, at least something belonged to him. Looking through Dickie Winkleman's old files before the whole system had gone electronic, Dell found that Dickie had put kids in categories. It seemed that the counselor had organized the students in terms of 3 things: activity level, patience, ability to pay attention. Counselor Winkleman had elaborated notes on and wrote up painstakingly detailed reports where he made an effort to quantify his students' abilities and deficiencies. Dell was impressed and horrified. There was no way he was going to try to imitate what Winkleman had done. It looked like way too much work. Dell would have to come up with his own way of sorting through the weeds of messed up students. It only took him 3 months on the job to get the Dell Duke counseling system in shape. He placed all of the kids he saw into 4 groups of the strange. First, there were the misfits, then the oddballs, next were the lone wolves, and finally, the weirdos. Of course, Dell wasn't supposed to give the kids any kind of classifications, but what good is an organizing system without methods of separation? Labels were important, and they were very effective. It was just too crazy to think that these kids on an individual basis. The way the Dell Duke counseling system broke it down, the misfits were the kooky kids who just couldn't help but dress different and act like fish out of water. The misfits had no power dynamic, and some of them may have been dropped as babies. The misfits, in all likelihood, were trying to fit in, but just couldn't. His next group, the oddballs, were different from the misfits because the oddballs were more original and usually somehow ahead of the curve. They liked being odd. The oddballs contained the artists and musicians. They had a tendency to be show-offs and eat spicy food. They were usually late, often wore the color orange, and weren't good with finances. And then there were the lone wolves. This group had the mavericks. They thought of themselves as protesters or rebels. The lone wolf was often an angry wolf, whereas a misfit was often calm and contented. And the oddballs were just out to a lunch where they made their own sandwiches. Finally, in Dell's classification of the strange, there were the weirdos. The weirdos included the zombies, those kids who stared straight ahead and gave back nothing no matter how hard someone tried to pry emotion out of them. The weirdos could be counted on to chew bits of their own stringy hair and fixate, non-blinking, on a dirt spot on the carpeting while a fire blazed right behind them. Weirdos were fingernail biters and liked to scratch themselves. They had secrets and were probably late to be toilet trained. The bottom line was that weirdos were just plain weird because of their unpredictability. And in Dell's opinion, they could be dangerous. It was always best to simply let a weirdo be. Game, set, match. Because Dell's files could end up in the hands of people in higher places than his windowless room in one half of the converted trailer on the property of the school district administration's office, he made a code for his unique system, which he thought of as FGS, which stood for the four groups of the strange. FGS broke down to 1 equals misfits, 2 equals oddballs, 3 equals lone wolves, 4 equals weirdos. He also, after much thought, color-coded his unique system. Misfits were yellow, oddballs were purple, lone wolves were green, weirdos were red. Dell then changed the front color on his personal files in his computer to correspond with his categorization. This allowed him at a glance to know what he was dealing with. The name Eddie von Snodgrass appeared on screen, and before the jumpy kid in the oversized jacket had even slid into his seat, Dell knew that he could secretly surf his computers for 42 minutes and nod his head every once in a while. Lone wolves didn't need much feedback because they liked to rant and rave. And so, while Eddie V went off on the chemicals taste of soda in plastic bottles, Dell checked out a website that sold bobblehead baseball player dolls at a very affordable prices. And Dell didn't even like sports memorabilia. But the Duke counseling system was up and working even if Dell was not. Because once a kid had been evaluated, Dell could complete the district's form in a flash, giving everyone in a specific category the same rating. Months passed. Dell kept the kids moving in and out. The trains full of the strange ran on time. And then on the afternoon that Willow Chance came to see him, all of his categorizations ground to a halt, like a fork thrown into the gears of outdated machinery.